Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening if you're in Asia, or good morning if you're in North America. Welcome to our webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about PREZONE2, give you an introduction and applications. Just a little bit of housekeeping to start with. I'm going to ask my colleague Matthew to chime in and tell me that he can hear me okay, just as a mic check.
Yep, I can hear you great.
Thanks, that's always good to know. So some more housekeeping. Any questions that you have as we're going through, please add them to the GoToWebinar questions box, and I will deal with them either as we're going through or towards the end. We have a Q&A section also. We also have a recording of this webinar, which will be available to you tomorrow, and I think you'll get that a link of that sent to you via email. And then also you will find right now in the GoToWebinar handout section, there is a PDF version of the slides that we're using today. Just an introduction to myself. My name's Ian Hodgkinson. I'm based in the UK and part of the application engineering group at Biamp. I joined Apart Audio in September 2009, and Biamp acquired Apart last July, so I became a member of Biamp at that point. Before that, I had worked for Biamp for 9 years back in the days of Audio, Auto One, SPM 522, and so on for 9 years. So to start off, a little corporate overview about Biamp, who we are, where we are, and what we're about. So the company itself was founded in 1976. The world headquarters is in Portland, Oregon, as I'm sure most of you know, but we also have many R&D centers. So yes, in Portland, but also in New York, Boston, Brisbane, Australia, Philadelphia, Antwerp, and now Modena in Italy, of course. Manufacturing is done in Portland and Philadelphia, as well as outsourcing manufacturing in China, for example. The support and services we have in all parts of the world, I'll list them there. I won't tell you them by name, but just to give you the good feeling that we have support resources all over the world, most times of the day and most days of the week. On the sales side, we're represented in over 120 countries. In North America, we sell directly to integrators. In other parts of the world, we sell via exclusive distributors in most regions. So the product summary of our range, we have many different facets now. So many of you will know the existing Biamp products of Tessera, Vocia, and Parley, of course. More recently, Devio was added in, as was Crowd Mics. Then the acquisition of Apart and Community last year added many different loudspeakers and different electronics offerings as well. More recently, Modena brought us wireless presentation systems, and then additions, of course, with Cambridge, SageView, and then unified communications offerings that we've recently offered to allow seamless operation with Teams rooms, for example, and many other UC platforms. The vertical markets we cover, very large, pretty much every market we cover, but business is a big one for us, as well as education. Sports venues, predominantly using the community loudspeakers. Retail and hospitality, houses of worship and transportation, covered by the Apart product family, and then the Tessera, I beg your pardon, the Vocia range, of course. And then healthcare and government are all covered as well. So what we're going to talk about today is a product called PREZONE2, which was showcased at ISE and started shipping soon after that time. I'm going to give you an introduction into the product and then go deep dive into controlling the device, networking with it. The accessories are available, some applications, and then finish up with the Q&A section. So the introduction, just briefly, for those of you that are maybe not so familiar with audio signal path and how these systems go ahead. The way this works with the PREZONE2 is you have the PREZONE2 at the center of the system. You feed into it all of your audio sources and some logic signals. So this could be line level signals, mic level signals, a paging microphone, and emergency interfacing, of course. Then we produce line level output sources. So it's important to understand that this is a preamplifier only, so it does not have any amplifier built in, so you cannot directly connect loudspeakers to this device. So we have external amplifiers. We have many different amplifiers in our range of products at Biamp. And of course, loudspeakers, again, equally amazing range of products in the loudspeaker side as well. So that's where it sits in a signal chain, if you like, of a very simple system. So we're talking about PREZONE2 today. So what does it have? It is a 2 stereo zone preamplifier. It has 4 stereo line inputs, 2 microphone inputs, an emergency audio and logic input, which is very important nowadays. And then we produce 2 selective, we've got a 2 selective paging input with chime. The user interface is completely end user focused. So you can see from the front panel, it's extremely easy to understand and know immediately what's going on with the product. In addition to that, we can also control a device from a web app on any web browser or with some specific wall panels that we have. It's important to understand, whilst it's not relevant in the day-to-day working, but it is actually a fully digital DSP design between the A to D converters on the input and the D to A's on the output. So everything you see is DSP inside this product, which allows us to do the multi-point user interfacing quite easily and be very flexible with the signal path. So the unit is 2U height in a rack, and it comes with the rack ears. We found that 1U is no longer demanded by the market because people are looking for a very simple and clear user interface. And this is a very similar concept to our successful MA series of mixing amplifiers. So going across the front panel, firstly, a simple on standby switch. So in most cases, you will not be turning the mains power on and off with this button. It's just putting the unit into standby or bringing it out of standby. Then we have a section for our microphone inputs, so microphones A and B. These are actually rotary encoders, so they're not real potentiometers with an end stop. And this means that they can be controlled from the front panel, but from other places within the device as well, using the WebApp, for example. So at all times, the illuminated LED ring will tell you where the level is on that control at any point. And then for each of the microphone inputs, you also have an on-off switch with illuminated LED to tell you if the microphone is actually enabled or disabled at any point. Then for zone 2, we have exactly the same controls, but they're on the other side of the device, on the right side. So it's important to understand both of these controls, both of these sets of controls refer to exactly the same input. It's just whether they are fed to zone 1 in the case on the left side or fed to zone 2 in the case of the right side image there. Then we go on to the music sources. So again, it's important to understand we have 4 line inputs here, stereo line inputs for 4 music sources that you want to feed into either of the zones. So whilst we have 2 banks of switches, it's important to understand the left bank of switches is to feed that music source or one of the music sources to zone 1, and the bank of switches on the right is to feed the same music sources to zone 2. And then for zone 1 and zone 2, again, you have a rotary encoder with an illuminated LED ring to indicate the position of the level control at any point. We also have space here for labeling, so you can label the sources and label the zones. And in fact, we include a set of labels with the product so that you've got some labels to start off with, or you can make your own, of course. Then on the right-hand side, we have a status section, if you like, whereby what this does is tells you things like that there is a signal present on zone 1, whether it's present or clipping, then similar for zone 2. And then there's an emergency mode active. So we'll come on to the emergency mode in a moment. And then there's an LED to indicate that the paging mode is active. And then lastly, to indicate that mic A Vox is activated. So Vox override from mic A is possible on this product. So looking at the rear panel of PREZONE2, first thing to understand is it looks modular, but in fact it isn't. It's a single circuit board along the back panel there. But we've given it a modular feel to make it very logical and clear to understand for installers. And this is very familiar with when you look at the, excuse me, this is going to be very familiar for people that have used our MA mixing amplifiers, for example, because it uses the same concept. So the things to understand here is we have from left to right our inputs, and then we have an output section, and we have a control section towards the right. The other thing to understand is the inputs, the highest priority inputs are located on the left side, and then moving towards the right, they move across to be lower priority. So priority from the left inputs to the right. So extreme left on the rear panel, the emergency input. This is the highest priority because, of course, the emergency safety in a building is paramount. When this section is active, it will mute all other sources and removes the device from standby mode if it is in standby mode. So this has a balanced line level audio input with isolation transformer, which is important because you may be having quite a long cable run on this line from the alarm system, for example. There is also a clip LED on the rear panel to assist with the level setting. There's also a contact closure. So you can use this in multiple ways. You can use it just as an audio signal from the emergency system. And when that goes above a threshold level set by the Vox control there, it will activate the emergency input section and thus disable all other inputs and mute the all other sources. The other way you can use it is to use a contact closure from an alarm system. And this is very common where an alarm system just has a contact closure output, which will become active when the alarm system is activated. So you simply connect that to the contact closure, and again, it activates emergency mode so that no other sources can be heard and the device exits standby. The level to both outputs is set on the rear panel level control. So if you are using an audio signal, the audio signal in emergency mode will be directly routed to the both output zones, and the level is set by this level control on the rear panel here. Then we have the first of our paging mics on the rear panel. So this has second priority, so priority 2. This, I beg your pardon, this is paging mic input. So this is priority 2. When the paging mode is active, it will mute all the other microphones and line inputs. So this has a mic line balanced input with gain control and clip LED. And then you have separate paging volumes, so the volume of the actual paging announcement from the microphone to zone 1 and a separate control to zone 2. There is a contact closure for zone 1 and a contact closure for zone 2. So typically we have this connected to one of our paging microphones, the MicPat 2. You also have an adjustable chime level, and of course you can turn this off so that when you have it turned off, there is no delay between the paging mode becoming active and the paging microphone being on. So the chime is very nice sort of chime just to pre-announce your message into each of the zones. Then we have our 4 music inputs or mic, sorry, I beg your pardon. Firstly, we have a mic B input there, mic B, which is priority 4, and then the 4 stereo line inputs, so that's priority 4. And again, we have rear gain controls and clip LEDs on all of these. So you note line input 1 has balanced input using Euroblock pair for stereo, and then also RCA. Inputs 2, 3, and 4 only have RCA unbalanced inputs, but each have a gain control, of course. Mic A, just backtracking a little bit, mic A on the left side there is a standard microphone input or mic line input with gain control and simple tone controls. But this is quite an important one because it also has a Vox override. So that means that if you start using this microphone and the voice coming into the microphone is above a predetermined Vox level, then it will duck all of the other microphone and the music sources so that by 30 dB, so that they're still heard, but they are not as relevant as the voice in that case. So that could be useful, for example, in a bar or restaurant to make an announcement, not an emergency announcement, but an announcement about a table being ready, for example. Also on the rear panel, we have 2 separate EQ or tone controls, one for zone 1 and one for zone 2. So that is EQ for the music only in each of the zones. And then we have the 2 zone outputs themselves. So identical in functionality, each of them has a mono stereo switch. So in the stereo mode, obviously a left input will go to the left output, a right input will go to the right output. But in mono mode, then it sums the left and right input from the music source, and but the mono sum of that signal is fed to all 4 of those output connectors. So in mono mode, you get the 4 outputs, which all contain identical program material. Also note that both the Zone 1 and Zone 2 outputs have both balanced and unbalanced stereo outputs there. So depending on the equipment you're connecting to, then you can choose the required cables there or required connection points. Then lastly, on the right-hand side, we have 2 connection points for wall mount control. So this is where you can connect our DIWAC or DDWAC wall panel controls, one for each zone. And then at the bottom, I think I talk about it in a moment, but that's the Ethernet connection as well. So on the rear panel in the control side, yes, we have the Ethernet control. This is to allow commands and feedback to and from the embedded web page for control and configuration. So this is where you would connect either directly to your controlling device, be it a laptop or a tablet or a smartphone, or via an Ethernet structure, so that you can control it from any device on the network with a web browser. We do support zero config networking, so that means you can connect your laptop directly with a straight network cable, but we also support and encourage the use of DHCP because it allows the router to control the IP addresses in the system. And of course, if you're using that method, you can reserve an IP address once you've made a connection and you don't want it to move. For example, if you're controlling it from an external source, you can reserve that IP address according to the MAC address within your router. We have auto standby on this device, so you have a switch on the back to enable or disable the auto standby mode. So we'll talk about that in a moment. And then a very nice feature is we have 2 24-volt logic outputs. Now these are used when, for example, you are using passive volume controls in line with the output from your loudspeaker to the loudspeaker zone. And this is very common because users want to have a level control that they can adjust within the zone, and a very simple level control. And that's fine, that's good. We very much support the operation of or use of those volume controls. But it does cause a problem because the when the volume control is turned all of the way down, if you make an emergency announcement, then you will not hear the emergency message. So what happens is when the emergency system or the paging system is active, it firstly sends out the audio signal to be sent to the zones, but it also activates the zone priority output, so zone 1 or zone 2 24-volt priority output. And that 24 volts can be directly connected to a relay inside the volume control so that it bypasses the volume control and therefore allows the message to be heard. Then lastly, we have a RS-232 control. So that's where we can control it from an external device, a touch panel control system, for example. And in fact, that's how you also make your firmware updates on the device. I've just got a note in the message box that we're not hearing sound. Matt, are you hearing me okay, Matthew? You're hearing me okay at the moment?
Yeah, I've been hearing you just fine.
Okay, hopefully Peter's back with us now. He was having problems hearing us, so hopefully he's back online.
Great. Yeah, he confirmed.
Excellent, thanks, Peter. Moving on, so going a little bit into the standby modes. So there's a switch on the rear, which is enable or disable of the standby mode. So in the disabled mode, when you press the standby button, it will go into standby, and it's deactivated by the emergency mode being active, turning the power off and on, or pressing any front panel button. So that will bring it out of the standby mode. Auto standby mode, however, is activated. So you have the switch on the enabled position on the rear panel here. So the standby mode is then activated by there being no signal present on a selected input. So that means an input where the switch is on. So for example, a music source input or a microphone. If the signal is selected or the source is selected and there is no signal on that selected input for 10 minutes, and there is a threshold of -37 dB for a mic or -40 for a music level input, then it will go into auto standby mode. So this is really a mode where the system realizes that it's not being used and therefore goes into low power mode to save costs and energy. The auto standby mode can be deactivated by one of many methods. So firstly, the emergency mode, if the emergency mode becomes active. Secondly, if the paging mode becomes active. then cycling the power off and on, or pressing any of the front panels, using a wall panel, sending an RS-232 or Ethernet command, or by pressing the exit standby button, which appears on the web browser in this mode. And the signal, and lastly, the signal which is presented to the input. So that's a really useful mode to just allow the system to stop using energy when it's not needed. So moving on to control of the device, various different ways of doing this. So the first one is via an Ethernet connection. And this is by using the built-in WebApp, which is built into the device, coded into the device. So this allows you to do configuration of the unit, controlling the device, and it uses a standard web browser. So you don't need an app, you don't need a special piece of software from us to use this. It literally just uses a web browser, which calls up the web app inside the device. The other way is to use RS-232 control and feedback. More about that in a moment. And then, as I mentioned, the DIWAC or the DIWAC wall panels and a paging mic. In all modes, all of these user interfaces work in parallel and are synchronized. So for example, if you are using the web app and you're looking at the web app and you start using the wall panel control, the controls will all move in unison. So if you turn the volume down in zone 1 on the wall panel, then the control on the web app will follow that immediately. Likewise, if you have multiple web apps, so if you have 2 different computers with the web app loaded using the same device, then they will also stay in sync if one person changes it and the second one can see that is happening. So the web app itself, it's a nice layout. As you've seen, it's scalable for a smartphone or a tablet or a PC. And indeed, it changes according on a Windows PC. For example, if you change the zoom level in your web browser, then it will also change the layout slightly. We also have a night mode, so this can reduce the light emitted from your tablet or from your PC in low light conditions. So taking you through the web app, we have the zone labels. So these are user definable or installer definable. So in this case, we've just got restaurant. We've got the level controls themselves. So we've used rotary controls here to emulate a simple volume control and to emulate the front panel, if you like. We've got the zone select buttons. So these are actually the buttons you press to choose zone 1 or zone 2, or in this case, restaurant or bar. So it's all very simple, especially when you're using a touch panel device. We've got the source select switches here. So in this case, they've been labeled. And it's important to understand that if you press the enabled or the source which is already enabled, it will turn off so that you then have no source selected. So it's important to be able to have nothing coming out of the system. Then inside each of the volume controls is a mute switch. So you can see here the microphones are muted, but the music, the CD player is actually enabled at the moment. We have some indications here for paging, emergency, and signal present and clipping. The night mode, so that's how you get it into the low light condition. The settings menu, and the power settings. In the settings menu, we have, for example, device info. So this is where you can find the device host name, IP address, software version, serial number, and MAC address. This is the labels section where you can set the labels for each of the zones. So in my case, it's restaurant and bar, and then the names for the microphones and the music sources. And it's important to understand that these labels appear not only in the web app, but also on the DIWAC wall panel when you're using those. The host name, so this is the name that you can use to call up the device in a web app if you don't know the IP address, or if you want to have multiple devices in the system, or you could call them sort of restaurant and bar if you've got multiple devices on the network, for example. So you can change that in here. You can also set volume limits, maximum and minimum for each of the inputs, so the microphones and the music sources. And you can apply a password to the device as well. So that means the settings section is all protected from end users who think they're a sound engineer all of a sudden. Then we've got a factory reset, so you can default the device back to default settings. If you come across a device where you cannot connect to it from the web interface, because maybe someone has set an obscure IP address, you can't find it, or it's outside your subnet of your network, there is also a way of hard resetting the device on the front panel controls, and that's detailed in the manual. I will come back to your question, Todd, in a moment after we've done this section. So on the RS232 control section, there's a 3-pin connector, of course, for making your connection to your controlling device. It could be a Windows PC, for example. There's a defined API, and this is it. This is everything that you need on the left-hand side. So we've used a flowchart kind of design to allow you to construct the control parameters that you need to send from your controlling device. It uses set and get commands predominantly, same as we're used to in Tessera and Vocia, for example. And it also sends out state change messages automatically. So for example, if somebody changes the source on the front panel of the PREZONE2, it sends out a serial command to the controlling device or to the listening device in this case, so that the local interface can be updated to stay in sync. The DIWAC itself has a 2-wire connection, just speaker cable. You don't even have to worry about polarity. Very simple controls with source up and down on the left side and volume up and down on the right side. And then the display, which is backlit, will follow according to the controls you've set, or indeed if someone else changes something, the controls on here will change. And the labels on the wall panel for the zones and the source names follow the settings page where you set the labels. And of course, as I said before, these are all synchronized with the web app and the front panel controls. Lastly, someone will ask, but you can only have one wall panel per zone, so it's not possible to have multiple wall panels on a single zone. So just going back to the question we had from Todd a little moment ago, when using the priority out 24 connected to a volume control and it bypasses that local volume level, at what volume level does the signal come out, assuming the local volume? Yeah, so that's a good question. It's actually when the volume control is put, or the relay is activated on the volume control, it bypasses the volume control totally. So it's maximum volume effectively. So the way you would need to operate in that case is set up your gain structure so that when the volume control is at maximum, that's the level that you want your emergency messages to be coming out at. So you can set the levels on the back panel of the PREZONE2 so that you can adjust those levels. And then of course you would need to set your gain structure around that accordingly. So that's the only way these wall panels work, or these volume controls work. So the 24-volt relay completely bypasses the volume control section of the device. I hope that answered your question, Todd. Oh, thank you. Yes, it does. Good. So moving on to the networking side of PREZONE2. So it's pretty flexible. You've got many different options on how to operate this device or incorporate this device into a network. So you can have a standard network cable from the PREZONE2 to your router, then have a cable from the router to your PC or Mac or tablet or smartphone. And in this case, this would be a router with a DHCP server built in. So the router will assign IP addresses to each of these devices and then allow them to communicate with each other across the network structure. Another way of doing this is a cable from the PREZONE2 to the router, and then Wi-Fi connection from the router to your controlling device, so the PC, Mac, tablet, or smartphone. And again, in the same way, the IP addresses are controlled by the router using DHCP. Lastly, to mention, we support multiple devices. So you, again, have the cable from the PREZONE2 to the router, but you have multiple devices which can then control the PREZONE2, as you would probably expect. Lastly, the zero config networking section. So we have a direct cable from the PREZONE2 to the PC. The PREZONE2 and the PC then auto-negotiate, and the IP address in the PREZONE2 and the PC use what's called linked local addresses. So they're normally identified by having the format 169.254.something.something. And that those X's in that number are actually created in randomly. So you very well, I don't think it's possible actually to have two devices on the same network with the same IP address in that case. But even if they did, they would then go into an auto-negotiate mode again and find themselves with different IP addresses. So in this case, there's no need for any manual IP settings in either device, which is quite a useful fallback. And that's important because it could be that where you're installing PREZONE2 just doesn't have a network structure. So you need to have this method of configuration and setting device up because you don't have a network on site, and you don't really want to have to carry a network router around with you just to set up the device. Lastly, a lot of people are controlling this device or want to control this device from a simple touch panel or smartphone, or in this case, a tablet. So with an iPad, you can actually have a direct connection. You do need a bit of external electronics in the Apple way. So you need an Ethernet cable, obviously, and that goes into a USB to Ethernet adapter. That then goes into the Apple camera adapter. And because the camera adapter needs to be powered, you need a 12-watt or higher iPad power supply and cable. So the power supply not only powers the camera adapter, but also supplies power to the iPad. So that's another option for a fixed installation where you want to have a touch panel installed. So connecting to PREZONE2 from a web browser. If there is a DNS server present in your network, in your router, so there's a DNS server which can look up the friendly names and associate them with an IP address, then in your web browser address bar, you just put in the address PREZONE2 / and enter, and it will find the device. If there's no DNS server, then you put in PREZONE2.local / and enter, and then again, it will find the device on the local network. If you don't have a DNS server, or indeed, if you're using a direct link local with an Android device, they do not accept the .local on that case. So lastly, the way you can do this is to find the IP address of the device, which will have been given by the router. So you can either find that in the router settings, or there's various programs, Fing being one of them, which you can use on a PC or a smartphone, and that shows you all of the IP addresses and devices on your network. So there's ways of getting this connected, and obviously once you've got it connected, whichever device it is, you can save it as a favorite on your desktop, for example, and it's always there for everybody to use. And as we said, if you're using an external control system and you're using the IP address in particular, it's always good to set that IP address as reserved in the router settings so that it always uses the same IP address for this PREZONE2. Then we have the scenario where you have multiple PREZONE2s on the same network. Obviously, if you connect them both together, they become aware of each other's presence. So therefore, the host names are automatically appended with -A, -B, and -C, and so on and so on. So you can then have the first device will be PREZONE2-A, the second one will be PREZONE2-B, and so on. So it automatically adds those when it finds a conflict of the host name. But if you want to, you could easily go into the settings and change the host name to be something different so that it's more easy for you to identify, for example, the location of the device. Okay, so optional accessories, we've mentioned these a couple of times already. So the DIWAC and the DDIWAC, simple wall panel control. The MicPat 2 is a 2-zone selective paging mic. So that means you can either page to both zones or to one of the zones individually. And so that means the music in the non-page zone will just continue playing as if nothing had happened in that mode. Then we have MicPat D, which is an all-zone paging mic. So there's one button on it. So you hold the button down and it does the paging live, and then you let the button go and it stops the paging. So all of these are compatible with PREZONE2. So some applications for you to consider. First one is a simple 2-zone bar with restaurant. So firstly, we can indicate here that we want to have different sources playing in each of the zones of the restaurant and bar and different volumes. So we talk about sources to begin with. So in this case, I've used one of our or two of our music players, which is the PMR 4000, an internet radio player with USB. Then we have a multi-source player with CDSD player and USB, and then a radio tuner. And then we've got a cloud internet radio. So that could be a restaurant chain private radio station, for example. But ultimately, it's 4 music sources and 2 mics, which you can feed into the PREZONE2. The music sources being stereo, of course, if needed. The microphones straight mic inputs. Then we have 2 stereo or mono zones coming out with different volume and source in each zone. So each zone acts completely independent to the other, so it can have a different source playing into each of the zones, and obviously different mics if needed. Selective or all zone paging. is there as well. And then we have control side, a control per zone with a wall panel, and a control of each zone via the web app. And then, of course, the emergency override is there. So if there is a fire alarm activated, it can mute or disable the PREZONE2 so that there's no sound coming from this device. So that's a pretty generic system with pretty much all of the facilities used on the PREZONE2. But you can see, hopefully, that that's giving you some ideas of applications here. So 2 zones, you'd be surprised how many applications demand 2 zones and a simple bit of control. Got another question from Jagdish. How many PREZONE2 can be connected to a network? I think it's a lot, but I think it's something probably up to about 128 or something. I'd have to check on that, so I will check on that, Jagdish, and let you know, unless any of I'm not sure if any of our engineering team are in on this webinar. Doesn't look like it, so I'll find out and let you know. Okay, moving forward with applications. So rather than just go through applications here again, I'll make you aware that we have some PREZONE2 applications on our Cornerstone support page now. So this is one that we made for a multi-purpose retail and event space. So if you open this PDF in the handouts, you should be able to get this link. But if not, if you go to Cornerstone in the design section, you'll find this in the hospitality section. And then we also have a more complicated one, which uses PREZONE2 as its core for mic paging to the 2 zones, interfacing to the fire alarm system, and background music from multiple sources. But then we have 2 different zones, each with sound masking. So this is an office space, for example, where you want background music, you want paging, but you also want sound masking. So this hopefully shows you an easy way of incorporating sound masking into a background music and paging system. So that's quite a handy little design there. So that's the end of today's webinar. I'd like to thank you for your attention and for attending today. My name is Ian Hodgkinson. There's my email address if anybody wants to speak to me about anything directly. Or as always, you can email support@biamp.com to give any questions on any of the products that we have at all. Thank you for your attention and have a great rest of the day.